Welcome to Nature Revisited, a podcast that explores our relationship with the natural world. It consists of interviews, stories, and discussions that highlight the notion that nature is not a place one goes to, but rather a place one is already a part of, that we are nature. For those of you new to the podcast, my name is Stefan Van Norden, and thank you, everyone, for joining me for this episode with Obi Kaufmann, The State of Fire. Obi Kaufmann is a naturalist, a writer, poet, and illustrator whose work focuses on the ecology of California. In 2017, he published the best-selling California Field Atlas, which was followed by the California Land Trilogy, The Forests of California, The Coast of California, and The Deserts of California. More recently, Obi has turned his attention to fire ecology and the place and purpose of fire, which is an essential part of the Californian ecology. Obi joins me from his home in Oakland, California, to talk about why California burns and what we can learn from it. So Obi, welcome to Nature Revisited. I've been looking forward to this for a long time.
Thank you so much for having me, Stefan. This is really a great pleasure. I've gone through so many of your episodes in the past week, getting used to your format and whatnot, and I'm really proud to be part of your portfolio at this point.
My pleasure having you on the podcast. So let's start with, what made you apply to the artist residency program of the National Park Service at Whiskeytown National Recreation Area, and what were some of the questions you hoped to answer by going there?
Oh, well, thank you for the question. You know, that's how it starts, State of Fire, why California burns. And I tell you, Whiskeytown NRA, National Recreation Area, it's managed by the National Park Service. It's really a unique little hub of California ecology. It's like Las Vegas in the summer, and then it's like Portland, Oregon in the winter. It's like the California Mediterranean climate there is exemplified to its greatest extreme. So this was about a year and a half ago. I was writing this book on fire, on ecological fire in the landscape of California. In 2018, the Carr fire came through there, and this fire was enormous. It was so powerful, fueled by such dry, arid conditions, that it formed one of these fire tornadoes. And this is a peculiar phenomenon. This thing was several miles high, a half a mile across, and it burned at 2,000 degrees. And at that temperature, as it made its way through one of these suburban neighborhoods near the National Recreation Area, it exhibits this phenomena called flashover. And a flashover, when it goes through a house, the house doesn't burn, the house evaporates. It just gets completely vaporized by the temperature and the heat. All that will be left is a slab of concrete, and the house is gone in 5 minutes. This is the destructive power of that fire tornado that was at the heart of the Carr fire, just outside of Whiskeytown National Recreation Area. 90% of the park burned, and I went there looking 5 years later, looking for how the land recovered. And I tell you, Stefan, this was amazing to behold. So I went out with botanists, I went out with rangers, we did some botanical surveys, and in those surveys, what they're finding are flowers that are new to botany, to California science, new species that have not existed primarily because of fire exclusion over the past 100 years, but are now set free in this nutrient vector that the fire finally represented. At the end of the day, what we have here is a resurgent landscape. But the landscape itself is an interesting character, very complex. What we have is really an anthropogenic landscape across California. All aspects of California's landscape have been sculpted by the human hand for tens of thousands of years. And at Whiskeytown, I found an example of this. We have here a landscape that in totality, philosophically, has us questioning what even nature or the state of nature or the quality of being natural might be. And I know that's something that you often tangle with in your podcast.
You start the book with some history of fire in California. Why is that history so important?
I'm fascinated by it. What it is, it's pre-colonial California and then post-colonial California. And I usually say it's post-gold rush. 174 years now, 175 years since that guy found that pretty rock in the river near our state's capital. When the Americans showed up in bulk. And when they did, what happens is a complete deformation of the natural regimes that have governed ecology and biodiversity across the state since time immemorial. This is the thing, Stefan, where we're balancing two stories in our mind at the same time. This very, very old story that needs to be remembered about, for example, what fire is and what fire does. And this very, very new story, this reckoning with so much historical injustice and really this revelation of how much was simply gotten wrong about disciplines like fire science and fire ecology more specifically.
So what did California kind of look like before those Americans and Europeans arrived?
California has always been changing. My books in general trace the entire Pleistocene, and even before that, we go back to like the mid-Miocene, about 5.5 million years ago is really when California begins to resemble its current tectonic configuration, if you will. But really, the configuration of arboreal habitats, that is to say, the configuration of forests around the state and how trees are distributed, is really, and this might be a shock to hear, is really only about as old as the ancient pyramids. What happened in the Middle Holocene about 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, there was this mid-Holocene climate optimum. And this is when we see indigenous California really come into its own. At least that's what the archaeological evidence tends to suggest, where we have hundreds of small indigenous tribelet families that really had deep local technologies about food production, say. And what we find is that it was all related to fire. Now, you have to remember that California had more tribes pre-contact than the rest of North America, excluding Mexico. California was that abundant in resources and available resources to the point where it's been described as California's matrix of pyrodiverse economies, the technology of fire use on the land. And it's interesting to note that indigenous nations of California is a culture that fundamentally eschewed the idea of sowing and tilling for some sort of agricultural basis, when instead it was pyrocultural, where you have the regenerative systems of fire applied on the land throughout the ecology to mitigate what they understood would always be coming, and what we're seeing and reckoning with now, which is the era of megafire.
So who was Junipero Serra, and how did he change the California landscape and its people forever?
Junipero Serra was the head of the California mission. He came in the mid-18th century looking to do this thing, save souls, to transform California's soul into something that resembles Europe. He brought grapes, for example. You think of California, you might think of like Napa County. It goes that far back. The first prohibition of indigenous fire mandated by the Spanish crown and later the Mexican crown. No more indigenous fires. Cut off the food supply. Make them dependent on the mission system. The mission monks were walking up and down El Camino Real, which is the road that connects all of the California missions, just tossing invasive grass seed to feed the cows. Cows are a new thing there. To such a degree that they overrun any ecologically successive ability of forests to regenerate in their normalized fire regimes. We've got this human invasion. We've got this invasion of different kinds of grass species. And we have a complete alteration of what plant nerds call the California floristic province, which is everything west of the Sierra Crest. California is an ecological island. And despite all of this injury, despite several hundred years of attempted European conquest, California still retains 99% of its indigenous plant population. And when I say that, that might appear shocking. 99%, that's a pretty good score. I would argue that there's no laurels to rest on. Every single one of our natural landscape types is either endangered or critically endangered. For example, we have about 1 to 2% of our native grasslands left in California compared to what they were just a couple hundred years ago.
So why are there more wildfires in California than other places?
I like the other question too. Why are there so many wildflowers? The two questions are not unrelated. So why are there so many wildfires in California? Remember, I was describing all of those indigenous fire regimes and all of that applied fire on the land. That all comes from deeper evolutionary histories of how different plant types have responded and built adaptive technologies, we'll call them, towards their own propagation in terms of fire. We have so many different species of plants that are not only adapted to fire, but in fact dependent on fire, including the largest tree in the world by weight, which would be the giant sequoia, which has to have temperatures in excess of 500 degrees in order for it to drop its seed at all. And so we've got these plants ready to burn, but they have to burn at a particular schedule across time and space. And it's kind of like a recipe. When you mess with the recipe too much, either you introduce all of these invasive grasslands from different biomes, or if you engage in policy of fire exclusion. I think that comes from a huge disconnect with the modern story of fire, is that despite all of these fires that we seem to have everywhere in California, across Northern California, there is a severe fire drought. Over the past 70 years, Northern California has burned at about 25% what it normally burns at, if even that much. We estimate indigenous fire counted for between 6 and 10 million acres of fire a year. Compare that with the largest wildfire year in recent history, 2020, and that was 4 million. 6 to 10 million acres. That seems like a lot of fire. How destructive that must be. No. Because we're talking about different quality of fire on the land as measured by acres, intensity, and severity. It's estimated that the average fire within that 6 to 10 million acre number was about 500 acres or so, with an intense burn region of about 10 to 20 acres. And you compare that with something like the Park Fire, which is still raging in northeastern California as we're speaking now, which is up over 250,000 acres with an intense burn zone of 100,000 acres. So it's not only a difference in degree, it's a difference in quality and category.
Not to be speaking for indigenous people, but can you share with us how a lot of indigenous cultures in California looked at wildness and wilderness differently than we do, and how important is that when it comes to their dealing with fire?
This is good, Stefan. Now we're getting a little philosophical. This is the area where I feel most comfortable. This is where I've taken the most time to really forge the quality of my own voice. I'm very sensitive to what is my story to tell and what is not my story to tell. It's really trying to figure out how to be more from this place myself. How do I understand it? How do I balance all of these different truths and non-truths? How do I cite the sources, what it is that might help in my journey? Because I recognize it's a journey, not a destination, of finally being more from this place. In that regard, I am really curious about what can be called the indigenous critique of colonial culture in California, which I am certainly a part of. We all are a part of it. You can't be alive in the 21st century and not be a part of it, especially if you do things like engage in the world of podcasts. The words that we use to describe natural processes must be analyzed to such a degree that when examined closely, most of them appear anemic to the quality of our continued residency in this imperiled place. And one of those words, which the word you asked about, wilderness, really came to the forefront in the passage of the 1964 Federal Wilderness Act. And so now about 19% of California's land area is dedicated federal wilderness area. Wilderness, though, as something that is untended, becomes something else. California has never not been untended. And that is a very important thing. When we're talking about wilderness, we might be engaging in another level of cultural erasure. M. Cat Anderson was an author who wrote a book called Tending the Wild, which is a book I took great inspiration from regarding the nature of indigenous fire on the land. And she quotes a Sierra Miwok elder. His Anglicized name was James Rust, and he's quoted at the beginning of the book when he says, "The white man ruined this country. It's all turned back to wilderness." And I think what he meant was exactly what we've been talking about, that there has never been a time in the modern history of California, and I say modern going back now across the entire geologic realm that is the Holocene, the past 11,000 years or so. There's never been a time when California has gone unstewarded by great amounts of people working with their hands to sculpt the environment in such a way that is reciprocal, that gives back. So when you're talking about wilderness, or we're talking about nature, even when we're talking about all of these policy words, conservation, to restoration, to preservation, these are project terms. These are not terms that mean something more like reciprocation. When I say more, I mean that they still operate in some sort of corporatized landscape of vocabulary. I believe my core vocation is poetry. I'm a painter and I'm a poet. And I believe that science vocabulary and political vocabulary lag behind what we storytellers can come up with. And so I work very hard at honing my arguments to transcend the nature, the dialectic nature of argumentation itself, to become stories in which there is no winner or loser, say, in a debate, but rather only a better story being told, because I think that that is the only way that human minds ever change out.
So what are some of the different types of fires, such as megafires, and how are they different?
You know, we talked about indigenous fire, right? We talked about pre-contact fire. We talked about anthropogenic fire, and that's one of the core premises of my book, is that fire happens in California less so because of trees, and it does because of people and decisions being made or not being made. Now, tracing that line of thought We can trace fire type by ignition type. Close to 89% of all fires in California are started by people. Lightning counts for just a little bit over 10%. One of the more interesting new kinds of fires that we've got recently is the gigafire, where megafires will be like 100,000 acres. A gigafire is 1 million acres. 1 million acres. The Mendocino Complex fire raged in 2020. The last 20 years have been the age of megafire in California. And that is partly due to an uptick in temperature and aridity across the floristic province. Also, what we've got with the fire exclusion, you've got infirmed, overcrowded forests that are drought-stressed and insect-ridden, unhealthy forests. This is the kind of thing that indigenous fire will help. Oftentimes, you'll see the word prescribed fire. So there's this great combination of different factors that have brought us to this point, to this era of Anthropocene megafire that is ultimately a reckoning that we have seen coming for decades. And by we, I mean the academic community who studies fire on the land.
So what is fire ecology, and how has it changed in the last couple of decades?
This is one of these things that the media has really yet to catch up with the science. You turn on the news any day talking about California fire, and the narrative is 100% destruction. They talk about forests destroyed. So here I am in Whiskeytown National Recreation Area, 5 years after that fire tornado. Remember that 2,000-degree fire tornado? Like ripped through the region. Here I am 5 years later in that same place, and we're having a super bloom of different plants. Now all the little saplings of all the different types of coniferous trees are coming up. It is a city of songbirds. And to say that this is a destroyed habitat, or to say that fire destroys fundamentally, is not only wrong, it's wrong at best. It's irresponsible at worst. It's just wrong. Now, fire ecology is the study, like all ecology. Ecology is best summed up as the study of consequences. I think that's my favorite definition of ecology, the study of consequences. And so fire is a vastly important tick within the adaptive cycle, the tick of the clock that all ecosystems exist inside of, from new growth to conservation to homeostasis, then to energy release in the form of fire, for example, and the whole clock resets itself. So it might be that we're resetting itself. And that process of resetting is the reason why for over the last 30 years, fire ecology departments across our major universities in the West have divorced themselves from forestry departments. It used to be that the study of fire was a forestry discipline, let's say, and forestry is agriculture of trees. And so fire ecology as a pure discipline is removed from that. And it's in that sphere that I hope that my work may be inserted. My calling is to present these ideas, these very complex ideas, as simply and as beautifully as I possibly can. I would say that fire ecology is different things, but it's really about how the chemical nature of fire on the land influences the quality of life for all habitats and all the populace of those habitats.
How would you describe fire?
Fire is not a thing. Fire is not an object. Fire is not inanimate. Once it ignites, fire exists in scales of time and space through patterns of behavior and regime. At its smallest scale, fire exists as flame. The flame is the instantaneous combustion reaction that occurs when its constituent components of oxygen, heat, and fuel are ignited. Fire is not biologically alive, but it does possess many qualities that give the impression that it exists as a form of life. This form of life can be described as ecological. If fire is ecologically alive, it makes sense that it would seem to possess many attributes reserved for living beings. Fire dances, it dies, it adapts, it sleeps, it even breathes. Fire seems compelled toward the consumption of fuel in a manner reminiscent of how plants consume sunlight. Unlike other abiotic ecological agents, such as soil type and meteorology, fire possesses a mindless will to exist. Fire will not be denied. Fire will not stop. Fire will not end.
Before we finish, I would like to ask you about the podcast that you do with your good friend Greg Saris called Place and Purpose. How long have you been doing it, and what is your focus?
Greg Saris is the chairman of the Federated Indians of the Great Rancheria, which is Santa Rosa, Southern Como, coastal Miwok, north of San Francisco. And up on the top of Sonoma Peak, where he lives, is where we met. It's a video podcast called Place and Purpose. The idea is we will watch the world change. So we sit still while the world revolves around us. So it's beautifully shot by the amazing, talented production crew at a firm called Wildbound. He's an author too. He's also a professor of literature at Stanford, among other things. He wrote many books about Southern Como mythology. They're ancient stories, and we go through every character, discussing what the coyote, for example, might mean to the Southern Como people. And this is all part of this resurgent effort to explore the old stories of California. And as an ecologist, I am fascinated by not only the content of these stories, but by the resiliency and adaptation of the people who tell them.
How is climate chaos influencing what Californians will face in the future in regards to fires?
I like that. I like climate chaos. As the temperature ticks up, we're seeing different things happen. The botanical portfolio of California is running north and upslope at a rate of about 25 feet per year. That is to say, the same ecosystems that were 25 feet lower 1 year ago are about 25 feet higher this year, and about a quarter of a mile northward. So everything is running up and north. This is how trees run. This is how botanical communities adapt. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be fast enough at all. There's a whole debate about assisted migration. In addition to just increased temperatures, increased aridity across the region, the climate models suggest greater periods of drought and greater periods of deluge. And that is at the expense of what California really wants, which is snow in the Sierra. Sierra Nevada is the nation's longest contiguous mountain range, 400 miles long, and it's the tallest as well. And it's California's water tower. California society in the 21st century gets about 3/4 of its total water from snowpack in the Sierra. And what we want is a deep, deep snowpack that melts slowly over the spring and summer. What we're seeing, though, is less and less snow with greater melt time. All of this is potentially configuring to be a whole mess by the end of the century for sure. That all being said, let me rephrase this, Stefan, because I am so sure that there is going to be a wholesale transformation of industry in California bent towards exactly the kind of issues we are talking today. If we were to engage land fire, for example, with the level of attention that it requires, it would not only transform, among other things, the state's gross domestic product, GDP, it would propel it. There is so much business to be done here that it will affect everything from software development to healthcare to the real estate business. If we were to engage all of the ecological requirements that are now being brought to bear by the scientific community, by the indigenous community, by communities across the state. I see it in agriculture. I see it in municipalities. I see it in government. There's enough sparks here to suggest that we are at the beginning of something great, some great transformation. And this is no pie in the sky type vision. I think, for example, you take what Californians have done with water, how this state has come into being over the past 90 years, And that effort will only be rivaled by how it will transform again over the next 90 years. And I don't think this is a gloomy thought at all. I think that when you're talking about California, you're talking about a will and an attitude that is unprecedented. The ultimate point, I believe, is that it is, and I think this is an intuitive thing, but to express it explicitly means everything right now. And that point is that by taking care of the more than human ecology of the world, we are taking care of each other. We are taking care of the human ecology. It is a complex thing. It is full of counterintuitive truths, for example, but it is investigatable. It is communicable. And together, we are coming to a common consensus, a common understanding of what needs to be done on a local, regional, international level.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Obi Kaufmann, and that you take the opportunity to read his new book, The State of Fire: Why California Burns, and that you visit his website, coyoteandthunder.com. If you enjoyed this episode, share with friends, family, and colleagues. And please rate us on your favorite podcast server. It will help us to reach a larger audience. You can follow Nature Revisited on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or our website, nordenproductions.com. I would also like to invite you to share your comments and ideas, and even suggestions for future guests for Nature Revisited on the comment section of this episode on our website. The music for Nature Revisited is Tim Buckley, Buzz and Fly. Nature Revisited is produced by Stefan Van Norden and Charles Gagan. And I hope you will join me for the next edition of Nature Revisited. And in the meantime, remember, we are nature.